Guy, just give us the biggest concern that people raised in the poll and that Jerry raised is on HGVs. You say you are aware that this is an area of concern. What is it the government is actually doing on HGVs? And is there given that it's it's a very difficult, vehicle class to electrify, is there a certainty that the timeline for HGVs is going to be slower than it is for cars?
So, as you may be aware, we consulted on the phase-out date for HGVs, and the proposal that we consulted on was 2 dates, so 2035 for HGVs up to, I think, 26 tonnes and 2040 for the heavier HGVs. We've had really interesting engagement within industry on whether those are the right dates, and all of the responses have just come in and we're assessing them. But certainly what we saw in the car market was setting those dates and doing it with confidence that we think the technology and the infrastructure will be there, galvanizes the market as much as the regulation itself, because it allows the people making the investments in the research and the infrastructure to get on and do what the private sector does best. So the phase-out dates is one part of it. In parallel, we know that government needs to invest to support industry, and money was made available as part of the 10-point plan, which is now being deployed on a number of research projects.
Great, thank you. And do you expect, a HGV specific question, should schemes to support HGV or like commercial vehicles, are those likely to be conducted on a national level, or are we going to see more localized incentives to support those?
So at the moment, in terms of the research, that's being led at a national level, but certainly when we look at the projects, the early projects that we want to fund, we're really keen to think about place-based solutions, because we're well aware that it may well be that different solutions work better in different places. So, for example, somewhere where hydrogen is looking like it will be a big part of the local economy, it makes sense to be trialling hydrogen infrastructure there. Other places, battery technology or even catenary may be a more pragmatic solution.
So you really think that there will be certain parts of the country where hydrogen is big and other parts of the country where battery electric is big? Because when we look at this globally, we kind of think that some countries might go for hydrogen, some countries might go for electric, but you think actually the UK might end up with areas that have both?
So I think what this conversation is showing is we don't know the answer yet. So we know that there are 3 technologies which could work, and what we want to do through our trials is really start testing those at scale and testing the infrastructure so that together with the private sector, we can work out what we should be pursuing as a country.
Perfect, thank you. You mentioned in your introductory comments about your work with local councils on street charging. And obviously this is a big challenge because it's up to local councils, and quite often they don't want to take parking away from people who don't buy electric cars, in order to give them to people who buy electric cars, who currently still tend to be more affluent. But what does working closely actually mean? Are we getting to a point at some point where you actually could force the local councils to install or have some sort of mandate system?
So you may have picked this up, Peter. We consulted last week on a huge range of ideas related to the future of transport. And one of those was the potential backstop power to mandate provision of charge points. I don't think that we would ever want to be in that position. We are much more keen to work with local authorities to give them the support and the funding they need to work out what's best for their local area. But we are now consulting on whether we need a backstop power in the unlikely event that some local authorities need a bit of chivying along in the future.
Yeah. And how much you say you've got 90 million? How far does 90 million actually go? How many on-street charges do you get for that? And what proportion is that of the number that we actually need eventually?
Well, wait for the infrastructure strategy to see a little bit more about what we think, not the number, but the range of public charges needed is. I think that's an unanswerable question because it's so different in different places. And that's exactly why we are doing the trials with local authorities at the moment to understand where is this in fact commercial and no government funding is needed at all, and where are the areas where, to make sure that there's an equitable transition, government really needs to put more funding and support in.
And it's likely,
it's
isn't
very
it?
Early days, I think, is what I'm saying, rather than being able to give you a precise answer.
No, that's perfectly fine. Look, I think I'm wondering if there's a chance that all the local authorities with areas where people can afford electric cars are likely to install charging points, and those in areas where people broadly can't are likely not to, and that'll lead to a sort of two-tier system and will potentially further entrench inequality. Is there a chance that we could see some sort of, I don't want to use the phrase leveling up, but some sort of political push to try and push electric charging points in places that might not normally install them, to try and drive electric adoption in less affluent bits of the country?
Well, as you know, levelling up is a huge part of the government's policy agenda at the moment. At the moment, what we're doing is working with all local authorities. Money is available for all of them to make bids into us, and we look at those on a case-by-case basis rather than specifically targeting particular areas. But certainly as the market starts to develop and we start to understand the data and the need, I can imagine we will be taking good care to check that all areas of the country are getting equal access.
Perfect, thank you. We've had a question that come in about EV tax advantages. Are those really going to remain in place at the moment as ICE cars on the road decrease?
So this is where I have to defer to my colleagues at the Treasury, who make the tax policy rather than the lowly officials at the Department for Transport. I believe the company car tax incentives are committed through to 2025, and beyond that, it will be a matter for Treasury.
And the charge point grant is also supposed to run until next April. Is that going to be extended? Do you know yet? Is there going to be something beyond that? There's lots of talk in the industry about this.
Which grant are you talking about there, Peter?
I've got a question that's come in.
Whole list of grant. So the plug-in.
It says, would it be the confirmation of the charge point grant removal next April? I wonder if that means the plug-in car grant.
I think the charge point grant, that could be referring to the home charging grant, which we are phasing out because we feel that market is now very well established and the price of installing a home charger has fallen a great deal. So we're really targeting that money now at more challenging properties, so blocks of flats, charities, places where we really want to extend the reach of charging points.
And I understand that obviously new homes have to have charging points in them and new blocks of flats will, but how difficult is it to make people who own, current blocks of flats to, retrospectively install charging points? How is that something that you're actively pursuing, or is it just too difficult to make that work because of grid connections or whatever?
So that's an area where we have put in place grant funding. I think it will then be for individual leaseholders and freeholders to discuss the practicalities. And as we see everywhere with grid connections, it's a very mixed picture. And some places there's a great deal of capacity, other places quite a small enhancement can mean that there's a tipping point and it's a more complex installation.
Yeah. Is it just going back to purchase subsidies for electric vehicles? Look, we know they've been coming down for the plug-in car grant. Is there a date we should have in our mind when those are going to disappear? I mean, the industry talks a lot about 2025 as the likely point when EVs will become cheaper than petrol cars to buy. Should that be the sort of date we have in our minds as to when the money from the government will finally run out, or will it be before then?
Well, I mean, just a point on price, and I think your colleague Chris Giles wrote about this in the FT last week. If you look at leasing, which is the way that something like 90% of vehicles are bought, we are almost at price parity now, once you take into account the running costs. So sticker price, absolutely, there is still a way to go. But in terms of running costs and total costs for many owners, we are not far off parity. This goes to the poll question that you started with. So money is tight. We have to work out the best place to deploy it. We are funded for the plug-in car grant for this year and for next financial year. But I would expect that we might want to shift our focus to vans and heavier vehicles and infrastructure over time.
Okay, so it sounds like start of 23 might be the last time that we get the plug-in car grant running. Look, we've had a question that's come in here about disposal of batteries. Who's going to be responsible for disposing of the batteries? Is that going to be the dealers, the OEMs themselves? We're going to have a sort of government, equivalent of the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency for electric car batteries. What's going to happen to them, if you know yet?
That's a good question, and I'm not the right person to answer it, I'm afraid. So I know that a great deal of work is going on battery recycling. Some information about it is set out in the 2035 plan that I referred to, but my understanding, without knowing all of the technical details, is that most of these batteries will have a life after they've been in a car, because at the point that they are the capacity has dropped below where they're useful in a car, they will still be incredibly useful for battery storage, which we're expecting to be a considerable part of the overall energy system solution going into the future.
Yeah, particularly as we decarbonize and we're reliant on renewables, you've got to find a way to store all the energy. Can I just ask you about the credit system that the government's obviously just consulted on, the ZEV system rather than the CAFE CO2 system that we have at the moment? You look at examples like California and China, you see that might work, but one of the things the industry constantly gets annoyed about is just changes in rules. Even if they're fine to meet them, it's another change in rules. They were all set for 2030, 2025. And if the rules change again, isn't it just going to cause more confusion for businesses?
So this is not a rule change to 2030, 2035. This is the implementation of the 2030, 2035 commitment. And the question on which we consulted was whether to achieve that through a continuation of the average carbon dioxide emissions regulations, or a combination of that with a ZEV mandate, which would potentially give more clarity to people who aren't steeped in the mechanics of CO2 regulation of what the minimum uptake curve would be. We're absolutely mindful of the burden on industry of any new mechanism, and we've had a very full set of responses from all of the car manufacturers and from other interested parties. That consultation closed a couple of weeks ago, and we're busy analysing the responses right now.
Okay, that's just one more thing on that. Obviously, the UK at the moment is competing for electric cars with other countries all over the world. Manufacturers only make so many of them, and they need to decide where they're going to send them. Does switching us to a different system, the ZEV system, does that make the UK less attractive as a place to sell electric cars compared to, say, Europe, because of the potential demands for homologation and accreditation and all those other things they have to take into account when they decide which market to send their EVs to?
Gosh, you could probably answer that question better than I could, Peter, with your understanding of the market. I mean, I don't think so. Very simply, I think it will give a very, very clear signal of the EV uptake that we're expecting in this country, for consumers, for suppliers, for infrastructure investors. I think it's great to be at the forefront in Europe. I hope that will bring investment and sales to this country, but of course we're looking at any arguments people are making that it could change the dynamic with Europe.
Perfect, thank you. We've got another question I'm going to try and sneak in the last minute or so. Someone asking here about charging speeds and saying, advantage of the Tesla network is you turn up and it's going to be fast, but with a lot of other EV chargers, they can be very, very slow. Are you looking at imposing sort of minimum charging speeds, minimum 22 kilowatts, something like that, for new chargers to ensure that people can have certainty when they turn up?
So we're not looking to generally impose charging speeds. the connections at motorway service areas that we're supporting will be super fast, so over 100 megawatts. We think that's right, given the demand and the type of charging that people are going to be doing in those scenarios. The other thing that we're doing through the consumer experience regulations, which we consulted on and will shortly be bringing forward and legislating for, is making sure that that data is really readily available so that people can understand before they set out what chargers are available, whether they're in use, and what speeds they charge at. But I think you sort of get to the tension in all of this. How much should government start imposing things and how much should we leave it to the market? Because there will be a great deal of value for the overall network and therefore the prices that can be charged for slow chargers, which enable that grid flexibility. So I don't think we're going to be in the business of saying these chargers should be this speed and these chargers should be that speed.
And there's been a lot of criticism from consumers of some certain charging network operators, I obviously won't name them, but about reliability of infrastructure. Is there anything you can do, right, to penalize, or you might say to encourage operators to have working equipment? Because otherwise it just harms the whole EV experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very clearly recognised as a problem. And again, that was covered in our consultation on consumer experience. And we will shortly be responding to that consultation and putting in place regulations around reliability, in addition to the data, which will help people understand and I hope and expect will help the market respond to the reality of what's going on out there.
Perfect. We are out of time. Thank you to all of you for asking your questions. Caroline, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your answers. We've covered a lot of stuff there.